Chapter 11. In this peaceful little town, the distant rumblings of World War II were barely heard. Though the Sino-Japanese War, which had started in 1937, was well underway, it was barely discussed on the news, which was broadcast on the large radio in the living room. With careful turning of the knobs, Yusuf Sheikh would catch the airwaves and tune into the solitary station from where a deep male voice could be heard through the static, enunciating in clear English diction a brief account of the distant war in Europe. For several years, the colonies had begun to resist the yoke of the British Empire, which boasted of the sun never setting on its acquisitions. But in the process of this expansion, it had spread itself thin and was now weakened by the German invasion of Europe, and was at the point where it had to defend its own shores. The opportunity now arose for the natives of the colonies, who had been agitating for some time, to assert themselves. In neighboring India, sporadic episodes of civil disobedience that had been occurring for several years now rose to a crescendo under the leadership of Gandhi. In Burma, resistance that had been quietly brewing among young intellectuals coalesced and found a focal point in a group who called themselves the Takhins. As early as 1936, the arrival of a tyrant in the form of a young man named Ko Aung San ultimately changed the color of colonization in Burma. Aung San had matriculated at the age of 17 among the top students, with distinctions in Burmese and Pali, and at university became the editor of the Students' Union magazine. He was vehemently opposed to the status quo and the vocalization of anger against the colonizers in an article, Hellhound at Large, whose author, Nyo Mya, he had refused to divulge to the authorities, caused his expulsion from the university. This led to a massive strike by university students, who held him in high regard, and the government was forced to concede to their demands and reinstate him. The strike had been initiated, organized, and presided over by two brilliant law students, Unu and Rashid, the first of whom not long after the war became the Prime Minister of Burma, and the other, M.A. Rashid, was Minister of Labor prior to the military coup of 1962. Ko Aung San later joined the Burma Association, an association founded by Ba Thong in May 1930. The members called themselves Takhin, or master, thereby asserting their supremacy over the invaders as masters of their own land, and in direct opposition to the word Takhin, which the colonizers demanded they themselves be addressed by. This deeply nationalistic group, which emphasized Burmese culture, language, and identity, aroused political consciousness in the indigenous population, particularly among a large number of disgruntled intellectuals. A pattern which lacked an understanding of essential differences that existed between the various colonized countries was attempted to be implemented by the colonial government in Burma. What Britain failed to recognize was that unlike other British conquests, Burma was comprised of a largely literate population. The monasteries had become centers of learning, where young boys were sent to acquire knowledge in Buddhism, and this developed their ability to read and write. Teachers were revered, as was their greatest teacher, Buddha. The gentle faith which eschewed violence imbibed the people with politeness in their dealings with all people, and misled the colonists into believing all of them to be acquiescent and simple. By 1939, Takhin Aung San, General Secretary of the Burma Association, and now studying law, had become a formidable opponent of the British presence in Burma. He helped found the Burma Twayagai around that time, his leadership qualities becoming apparent and formidable to such an extent that in 1940 the government issued a warrant for his arrest. Aung San quickly left Burma and headed to China with the intention of getting assistance from that source, but was intercepted by the Japanese, who invited him to Tokyo, where he was offered money, arms, and support, including a promise of independence for his country in exchange for assisting the Japanese invasion into Burma. He agreed to their terms, and in preparation for this, he and 30 of his Takin comrades received military training in Japan. The Burmese Independence Army was formed in Bangkok, and at the age of 26, Aung San was appointed Chief of Staff. By 1942, with the fall of Rangoon, the Japanese military administration took control, and Aung San became Commander-in-Chief of the Burma Defense Army, which later became the Burma National Army. He was further promoted to become Major General Aung San and was decorated by the Emperor of Japan with the Order of the Rising Sun. Chapter 12. A large proportion of the population of Burma remained oblivious to the political maneuvering behind the scenes, this being particularly true of the people of Kalor. The newspapers always arrived several days after events had occurred, so that Germany's invasion of Poland and the subsequent declarations of war on Germany by Britain and its allies became topics for discussion in history classes at Kingswood School after considerable delay. For the young boys like Eunice and his friends, war was a term that conjured up images of battles between valiant knights draped in armor on horseback, wielding lances and jousting with the enemy. It was something one read of in history books and belonged to a long-gone era with no bearing on the present. Europe was a place on the map, not really part of their world, and though they heard of a man called Hitler, the full extent of the sinister evil of Nazism that was inherent in his actions had not yet pervaded their lives. For these boys, and for Eunice in particular, things just happened, and you accepted them without analyzing, without questioning why, nor worrying about the future. However, something was impacting the daily life of the townsfolk. A change was taking place, though subtly at first, like the shortage of gasoline, which gradually reached a critical point. But then, with typical innovation at times of scarcity, the people burned wood and charcoal and created methane to drive their cars. Soon, certain commodities, such as sugar, which had been in plentiful supply, became scarce or just not available. Then quite suddenly, news arrived about the Japanese advance into Burma, and the British government was taken by surprise. But even when reality set in, the government still underestimated the strength of the Japanese militia. The Royal Air Force had a limited presence in Burma, and of those battalions of the army that existed, many sections had been transferred to other countries to fight what was considered the Greater War. What remained to defend the country was minimal and thinly dispersed. To further aggravate the situation, communication between the various air bases was carried out by inefficient telephone and telegraph systems. As a result of the main airfields along the southwest coast at Victoria Point, Tavoy, Moulmein, and Mergui were extremely vulnerable to attack and soon fell to the Japanese. Tuning in on the radio on December 23, 1941, Yusuf Sheikh was able to discern through the static that bombs had fallen upon Rangoon 2 days before Christmas, and again, almost with cruel planning, on Christmas Day itself. What my father didn't hear was that machine guns, mounted on Zero planes, had spewed out bullets which indiscriminately mowed down citizens in that city. The long trenches that had been quickly prepared by the British government in the Maidans and parks were of no help. Dismembered body parts flew into the street, in front of the homes on Mogul Street and other areas in the vicinity. Some people made miraculous escapes, like the couple who were unable to reach the trenches when the siren sounded and stood petrified under a tree with their eyes shut tight and their hands covering their ears as the planes roared in and a hail of bullets and shrapnel splintered the air and ground around them. When the sound subsided, they found themselves trembling uncontrollably with shock at what they had just experienced, and with amazement at finding themselves unscathed. Days afterwards, the stench of untended, decomposing corpses hung in the air. Prisoners who had been confined in the jails were either released or escaped, and looting and arson added to the terror and chaos. Droves of people who were pro-British, mainly Indian, Anglo-Indian or Anglo-Burmese, anticipated that the Japanese army would advance from the south by sea, and thus attempted to flee northwards. Men and women, carrying their children or with them trailing behind, walked hurriedly, their belongings in bundles or suitcases, or stuffed into pas, which were balanced on their heads or held under their arms. The affluent fled in cars, others on bicycle, many on foot. Bullocks with wide, frightened eyes pulled carts that were being propelled forward on squeaky wheels, loaded to more than capacity with bedding, tea kettles, pots and pans, as well as people of all ages and sizes. In long lines they rumbled along, while the drivers goaded their bullocks forward at the fastest possible pace. A solitary woman carrying a baby on her hip, running behind a bullock cart, and losing one of her slippers in the process, didn't halt to pick it up. The elderly and the weak, already weary, straggled along behind their families. People fled north or in any direction where it was rumored there was a route of escape. They trekked through thick jungle and barren hilly terrain, crossed wide, fast-flowing rivers in flimsy rafts, had to deal with snakes, mosquitoes, leeches, wild animals, and human beings who looted and plundered in a desperate attempt to survive. They died in droves, men, women, and children, of disease and starvation, while they dragged their tired, blistered, and battered feet along paths ill-suited to town and city dwellers. From Rangoon and other locations in the south and southeast, they traveled through Tayemo toward Michina and turned west toward Imphal. Once on the Indian side of the border, they continued by train via Assam to Chittagong and then by ferry or train to Calcutta. Chapter 13. Ayub Ahmed, who later became my brother-in-law, was just a little boy when his family followed a similar route. They became concerned about the Japanese advance into Burma, and after lengthy discussions decided to move out of Rangoon till they could be sure that it was safe to return. Ayub's grandfather thought that the best time for them to travel was at the end of the rainy season, toward the end of October. So, collecting all members of the extended family as well as friends of the families, they traveled to Wanechang, a small town about 40 miles northwest of Rangoon. Here, Ayub's grandfather owned a large forested area which enclosed a lake, an idyllic setting for the wildlife that thrived there, and which also comfortably accommodated the large group of about 40 adults and children. They awoke one morning about a month after their arrival to the sound of aeroplanes and witnessed a battle in the sky between Japanese fighter planes and British Spitfires, which were spewing a barrage of machine gun fire at each other. Ayub watched, together with some other young children, excitedly listening to the whining sounds of the aeroplanes. Suddenly, one of the Zero planes burst into flames and fell from the sky in a trajectory directed straight toward their makeshift shelters. With wide eyes riveted to the incendiary mass, they held their breaths till the object veered away from the huts and crashed into the forest with a very loud bang. Driven by natural curiosity that overcomes caution, the children lunged forward and raced through the jungle in the direction of the blazing object. As they drew near the still flaming fragments, they were struck by a strong odor of burning flesh, and looking more closely, discovered sections of the pilot's body lying in the midst of the wreckage. Ayub recalls, it was the lower portion of his body that was being barbecued. Today, Canada is home for him, and though he is far removed by time and location from that place and that moment, The horror of that scene is once more sharply evoked when barbecues in the summer permeate the air with the smell of burning flesh. Toward the beginning of the following year, shortly after the bombing of Rangoon, the entire group who had gone to Wanechau decided to return to Rangoon. Here they observed firsthand the devastation of the bombardment. Giant holes in the streets gaped skyward midst collapsed buildings, while people who hadn't fled now straggled north in whatever mode of transport they could find. The elders in Ayub's family realized that the wisdom of staying on in Rangoon under the circumstances was not merited, and they headed back to Wanechau before deciding to move further inland through Prom and on to Tayetmio, a small city on the Irrawaddy. Here they boarded a 2-story riverboat and traveled to Moyua, where they stayed for a few days before proceeding on to Kalewa. This was the point from where they trekked all the way to Imphal and into India. They were among those who were fortunate enough to be able to rent bullock carts, and Ayub remembers the tortuous route and how they survived by living off the scant pickings in the forest. He was an important member of the food-gathering group upon whom the others depended. They foraged everywhere for whatever they could find, wild animals, plants and roots, or anything growing on trees, such as wild jackfruit, which were too high even for the tallest in the group. These were collected by hoisting Ayub onto the shoulders of Ghaffar, the big, tall Pathan who had accompanied them and assisted in various tasks. On one occasion, the food-gathering party approached an area of overgrown shrubbery in the forest and pushed aside the branches and tangle of weeds to find anything that might be edible. Here the ground was damp in places, and beneath the dense undergrowth they saw a porcupine who, upon sensing their presence, began rattling its tail and flaunting its sharp quills. Ayub and some of the others jumped back, but Ghaffar took a long, sturdy bamboo pole and prodded the creature with it from a safe distance. With all its defenses up, the porcupine struck at the pole again and again with its quills, and succeeded only in losing them, because though sharp enough to puncture human flesh and relatively strong material, the barbed quills fell harmlessly against the pole and fell to the ground. The creature stomped its feet on the ground and kept up a series of intimidating gestures till Ghaffar gave up, saying that they couldn't eat it in any case, unaware that it is regularly eaten in many parts of the world. He also told them, later, that if the quills had pierced their skins, they would have had a real problem, because the quills would have gradually worked their way inward, as he had seen happen to an unwary dog. The expressions of the young people around him, who had laughed with amusement at the antics of the porcupine, now turned sober at the recognition that the creature could be quite a formidable foe. Snakes, among other things, were a constant source of concern, causing them to hunker down in the bullock carts at night to avoid being bitten, while a guard, comprised of a few adults, took shifts to keep the reptiles and other wild creatures at bay. Even though snakes are not known to bite unless threatened, fear of a hungry python that was supposed to have constricted and swallowed a child was a story that had been circulating among the evacuees and was believed to be true. The children spooked each other by imagining and narrating exaggerated versions of this, but once they closed their eyes, sounds of the forest and inner visions blended into dreams, shutting out the darkness of the night. At times, Ayub thought that the forest would never end as they journeyed on for miles and miles through dense jungle. But he was told that he should be patient, for they had come close to the border with India and their trek was nearly over. They had moved far to the northwest boundaries of Burma, where the terrain became mountainous and temperate and tropical vegetation merged, filling the air with a blend of exotic scents and pine. Their journey continued northwestward into the rugged mountains and steeply inclined valleys of the border region between Burma and India. After several days, they found themselves in the scenic but dreaded area called Nagaland. This was considered a particularly dangerous section of the route they had taken because it was rumored that the area consisted of the cannibalistic Naga tribe. Though cannibalism had never been verified, it was known that these tribes were headhunters, and it had been authenticated as a fact by explorers who had found a pile of human skulls in a Naga house, specially built to house a collection of these items. During tribal wars, it was said, each adult Naga male was expected to contribute the severed head of an enemy to this horde, indicating that he had been courageous and victorious. Tense and alert, the refugees were slowly trekking their way around the base of a mountain when they suddenly found themselves surrounded by a group of fierce-looking, almost naked men. The menacing posture of these men, each of whom carried a sharply pointed bamboo spear, filled the bravest of the refugees with dread. These braves had the typical Mongolian features of the northern hill tribes, some of them having tattoos which covered parts of their faces so that they appeared partially blue. They wore nothing but thongs, yet were attired in full headgear made up of 2 large canine teeth of the wild boar. These rose conically upwards from just above the ears toward the crown of the headdress, which at the apex was fluffed up with black and white hornbill feathers. Their sunburned skins looked bronze in the afternoon light as they began closing in on the terrified group. The children whimpered and clung to the women who hugged them close, hoping that their own menfolk would take charge and keep them safe. Then Ayub's grandfather stepped forward, directing his attention to the man who appeared to be the leader of the group, and performed a carefully crafted mime with very submissive, non-threatening gestures. He waved his hands, then pointed at the Naga spears and shook his head, gesturing negatively to indicate that his group carried no weapons. He opened his mouth and patted his stomach while raising his hand to his lips, as if he was partaking of food. From the tired and frightened faces of the group and the emaciated condition of their physique, it was obvious that they were defenseless and desperate for food. The man whom the grandfather addressed seemed to be listening to the unspoken words, because he squinted his small eyes and watched the miming intently, his thick lips slightly parted so that his front teeth, darkly stained a brownish red with beetle juice, were clearly visible. Some of the refugee women later admitted that they had assumed the stains on the man's teeth to be the result of his having partaken of a recent gruesome meal of human flesh. The Naga leader turned to his men and spoke in a language Ayub's family had never heard before, and which they later said sounded a little like the Gorkhali that their Mali spoke. The man then beckoned Ayub's grandfather and the rest of the group to follow him. Unsure of what was to become of them, the men, women, and children followed him, while the tribal men walked alongside, following the leader. A whiff of smoke wafted toward them as they approached a small village. They realized that the man who had led them there was some kind of chief, because of the deference with which the villagers greeted him. The huts were small, but well made of wood and had thatch roofs. Some had intricate carvings on the front. They were led toward a hut from where the aroma of cooked rice and fried fish emanated, sharpening their pangs of hunger. They were made to understand that they were to sit down, so they settled their tired bodies, squatting on the ground, huddled together, awaiting their fate. To their relief, boiled wild rice and strips of fish that had been grilled on an open fire was served to them on banana leaves. Compared to what they had been surviving on recently, this was a feast, and they dug into it ravenously. Hopefully, and again with hand gestures, they asked the Nagas where they themselves might catch some fish to supplement their meager diet. Obligingly, they were taken to a hut where a man was stringing up strips of meat over an open wood fire to be cooked. They then noticed that the fish from which he was carefully cutting long strips were a batch of dead snakes. The food they had so eagerly devoured had been smoked snake with wild rice. Of this incident, Ayub said, "Some of us really became sick on seeing the snakes and threw up the food we had eaten." Then he rather proudly declared, "Well, but I didn't vomit." It is interesting how we limit ourselves gastronomically and culturally, confining ourselves narrowly to only that which we have become accustomed to or toward that which we are genetically predisposed to. In Burma, milk and butter is considered smelly and unpalatable by the indigenous peoples, probably an olfactory defensive response because, like some native inhabitants of North America, they are also lactose intolerant. However, they happily partake of suboyue and ngapi, the former being leaves of a plant with a strong, unpleasant odor, and the latter a pickle made of fermented fish with a similar smell. The frazzled group, now with diminished appetites, soon continued on their way, and it seemed they had to walk on forever. But their spirits lifted as they neared Imphal on the Indian side of the border. Here they saw hundreds of refugees in similar plight, being assisted by Indian officials, and like them, they too were given food and shelter. There were many happy reunions among the refugees who met up again with friends or relatives who had either left Burma earlier or who had used a slightly different route. Ayub's family were delighted to find a man who had lived almost next door to them in Rangoon. He told them of his trek and how on one occasion he had undergone the terrible ordeal of having to travel on a raft in a raging river. He said that there had been a large number of men, women, and children on the raft, and they had clung to anything they could grasp as the waves lifted and dropped the pontoon-like craft. Suddenly, an enormous wave swept under and over them, lifting the flimsy craft up and against the walls of a cliff. He was sure that this was the end for him, and his voice rose with those of others, calling upon their respective gods against the sound of the rushing water. Miraculously, the raft didn't tip over, but to their horror, they found that the water had swept a young brother and sister off the raft and left them suspended upon a narrow ledge on the side of the cliff. And while they looked on helplessly, the rest of the refugees, including the distraught parents, were swiftly carried away downstream. There were many other heartbreaking stories exchanged of those who had died of starvation and disease along the way, as well as stories of courage and generosity and the resilience of the human spirit. Ayub and his family were grateful for the help they now received in India, and once they recovered sufficiently from their ordeal, they finally took the train to Calcutta.